welcome to you all very much to the British Institute Ankara event tonight, the Sir David Logan lecture entitled Turkey's Middle East and Wider Foreign Policies. It's very, very nice to see so many of you here. Sir David will talk about his time as ambassador, which he was in Ankara from 1997 to 2001. And then he's been the chairperson of the Institute since 2006 to very recently. And in today's lecture, he will touch on Turkey's place in the West, whatever that may be, its geopolitical location between Greece and Russia, the end of the Cold War, and the situation that put Turkey in, very much in terms of clarity, the rise of the AKP, the neo-Ottomanism of Davutoglu, problems with the US, which have been exacerbated more recently, its relations with the European Union, and then the dreaded B word, which I always promise I won't mention, Brexit, and what that means for the future. So he'll finish with the question of, will Turkey become part of Middle East turmoil rather than a bastion against it? So David will talk for about 45 minutes or so, and there will be approximately half an hour for some questions. And then there are drinks which will be served in the room opposite this one, so through the foyer and then on the other side. So I'll hand you over with no further ado.
It's amazing that so many of you could come. I thought you're here on false pretenses because the flyer for this event had pictures of President Trump, President Putin, and President Erdogan, and for some reason they failed to turn up. It's a topic which, as you know, you might call volatile. There was a day a couple of months ago when President Trump threatened to devastate Turkey economically. And the following day, they had a sort of workmanlike discussion on the phone. And I'm sure you're not so old-fashioned as to think that your enemy's enemy is your friend. I mean, that's just so pre-millennial and irrelevant in the Middle East and well, everywhere really. So only 10 years ago, I think the defining features of Turkey were its multi-party democracy, its membership of NATO for more than 60 years. It was the bastion of the alliance's southern flank. EU accession negotiations in progress since 2004, and an economy growing faster than anyone's in the world after China. Now what do we think of? We think of autocratic government, terrorism, regional instability, Russian opportunism, the breakdown of relations with the EU, and also, I think, the failure of Western strategic vision. So what accounts for this? And I'm going to divide what I'm going to say into four parts. Firstly, the Cold War era. Secondly, the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which unleashed tensions and conflicts which had been frozen by the Cold War. Thirdly, the revolutionary policies introduced by Erdogan's new government in 2002. And finally, the post-Arab Spring period, in which Turkey became increasingly entangled with Syria, and the region was destabilized by powerful outsiders such as the United States, Russia, and Iran, for whom Syria has become the cockpit for a proxy war. So first of all, post-war period. Global politics were defined by the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West. And in this context, of course, Turkey assumed tremendous importance. It shared a border with the Soviet Union and across the Black Sea with more Warsaw Pact countries, and it controlled access from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean via the Bosphorus. For Turkey, the legacy of Ataturk, to reach that which was to reach the standards of contemporary civilization, meant connection with the West. Membership of NATO and of CENTO, whose other members were Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and the UK, contained risks as well as advantages for Turkey, but Ataturk's vision, as well as protection against Russia, the old enemy, which NATO membership, of course, provided, were the factors which prevailed. Okay, secondly, the end of the Cold War. The tectonic plate started to shift with the fall of the Soviet Union and the liberation of the Eastern European states. The loss of Soviet influence led to the release of hitherto suppressed nationalist, ethnic, and sectarian differences in the Balkans and the Middle East. And these were factors which were aggravated by the ambitions and whims of local autocrats. In 1992, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Turkish President Özal threw his weight behind the American-led coalition, but he did so in the face of opposition from most Turks, who believed that the cost in terms of their relationships, political relationships in the region, and the risk of the breakup of Iraq was too high a price to pay. And the foreign minister of the day and the chief of the general staff of the day both resigned. Then came the violent dismemberment of Yugoslavia. Many Turks, as you know, come from the old Ottoman lands of the Balkans, and they were angered by what they saw as Western indifference to the fate of the Bosnian Muslims at the hands of the Christian Serbs. Closer to home, the demise of the Soviet Union led to new challenges for Turkey. There was its relationship with the newly independent Turkic countries of Central Asia, and it unfroze old conflicts such as that between Turkey and Armenia. The enlargement of the EU gathered pace, but Turkey resented being overtaken by the Eastern Europeans in the queue for membership, and rightly regarded the accession of southern Cyprus before the island was reunited as a betrayal by the Europeans. Throughout the 90s, Turkey was under heavier pressure to play an active role in bringing down Saddam Hussein. But the likely damage to Middle East relationships was a serious concern. And fears about a breakup of Iraq were now aggravated by the rise of domestic terrorism from the Kurdish PKK because of the latter's links with Kurds south of the border. After 9/11, the US plan to bring down Saddam included invasion from the north through Turkish territory and the use of Turkish resources. The AKP government was brand new, and this confronted them with this old dilemma, west or east, in the starkest possible terms. The Turkish parliament rejected the proposal that this avenue should be provided to the Americans. Contrast with Westminster, by the way, who was at the vote at the time. And the furious reaction in the United States stirred a debate about in both countries, about the extent to which the bilateral relationship mattered at all. Another third phase, which was when the new AKP government embarked on a fundamental foreign policy review. Unlike its secularist, military-influenced predecessors, it didn't view foreign policy entirely through the optic of security. It took account of political interest, trade, and historical relationships, and felt that these should be the main drivers of foreign policy rather than security. And just as important, the calculation was that foreign policy should be made with a concept in which Turkey was the centre of its own region, and it had multiple and complex relationships in that region, rather than at the edge of another region, in other words, Europe, in a relationship to which it always appeared to be a peripheral and perpetual supplicant. And for a period, this went very well, in particular in relation to Turkey's Arab neighbours to the south, with whom trade burgeoned and old historical and cultural collections were revived. But before long, a policy which was based on the notion of zero problems with our neighbours started to emerge, and the inherent flaws in it became increasingly apparent. And Turks started to joke that instead of zero problems with our neighbours, they had zero neighbours without problems. Turkish support for President Morsi's government, which was toppled with Western acquiescence, led Turkey into the Sunni side in the increasingly confrontational Sunni-Shiite divide in the Middle East. So that gets us to the present. So this is good, isn't it? We should be able to have a drink before too long. I'm going to start with Syria, not necessarily because it's the most important driver of Turkish foreign policy, but because it's a powerfully destabilizing element in the skein of unstable relationships which make up Turkish foreign policy. It's also an issue which disfigures not only Turkish foreign policy, but Turkish society as well. There are some 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. The Turks have run the refugee camps for these Syrians in exemplary fashion. They're better than UN camps. They've been extraordinarily welcoming. But some of the refugees are beggars. Others have started small businesses to the detriment of Turkish competitors. Very few will ever return to Syria. And they inevitably include ISIS terrorists who have fled Syria. So the Syrians in Turkey have become an easily exploitable and divisive issue in domestic politics. Externally, the horrific dismemberment of Syria put Turkey in the position of supporting the Western alliance. There were ISIS terrorist attacks in Turkey in retribution. Turkey also confronted Kurdish forces in northern Syria, the PYD, which they believed to be closely linked with the PKK, the terrorist organisation inside Turkey, with whom there has been a war being waged now for over 30 years. So this brings us, I think, to Turkey's relationship with the United States. It's always been bumpy, but it's also been fundamental to Turkey and important to the United States as well, for both unilateral and for NATO reasons. It's the major military power on NATO's southern flank. In the context of Syria, this relationship has been very deeply tested. First by Obama's loss of nerve on the issue of Assad's chemical weapons, and secondly by the role of the Kurds in Syria, on whom the US has placed heavy reliance for provision of effective ground forces, and whom have been supplied by the United States with weapons to complement American air power in the fight against ISIS. This makes the US-Turkey relationship pretty close to unmanageable, and gives the relationship between the PYD, these are the Kurds in Syria, and the PKK, these are the terrorists in Turkey, it makes the prospect of a Kurdish settlement within Turkey seem very, very remote at present. There are now complex arrangements in place between the two, between Turkey and the United States, to prevent open conflict between two NATO allies. But Trump's decision now to withdraw from Syria has not only generated conflict between Turkey, Russia, and Iran as to who should inherit the territories held by US allies in Syria, it also, of course, raises the prospect of Turkish revenge on the PYD. Well, you know how it is with the American administration. There's now a walkback, who a couple of years back made it not be such a good idea after all to leave the PYD to the fate of the Turks. And what would happen if ISIS became active again, or if there was a growth of Iranian activity in Syria? So Jim Jeffries, the US Special Envoy to Syria, has now said there's no timetable for withdrawal, and that a number of troops will remain in Syria for the foreseeable future. There are other serious issues, of course, which divide the United States and Turkey, these including the fate of Fethullah Gulen, the alleged leader of the aborted coup in 2016. The Turks have wanted him extradited. He hasn't been extradited. There's the apparent Turkish intention to purchase Russian S-400 missiles. This isn't just a political or a commercial challenge to the West. The acquisition of S-400s would seriously compromise the effectiveness of NATO systems and would probably lead to the exclusion of Turkey from the F-35 fighter program, of which they are a part. There's Turkish complicity at the highest levels with Iranian sanctions busting and money laundering on the part of Reza Zarrab, an Iranian businessman. Then there's the fact that you may have noticed that Turkey, along with China, Russia, and Iran, are the countries who support Maduro's regime in Venezuela. So American officials, I think, they may recognize that they have a long-term interest in a stable Turkey, but though Turkey is a treaty ally, they certainly don't regard Turkey currently as an effective partner. As with the United States, so with Russia. After the Second World War, Cold War imperatives overlaid all other issues between the two countries. And these, of course, re-emerged when the USSR broke up. Much of the, as you know, much of the Soviet Union had been Turkic, and the Turkish president of the day, President Özal, planned a Turkic Commonwealth of Nations. This proved to be over-ambitious, and it was over-ambitious in part at least because of Russian resistance to it. But there remain many Turkic peoples in Russia itself, for example in Tatarstan and in Dagestan. Chechens now use Turkey as a haven from Russian pursuit. And Russian occupation of the Crimea, where part of the population in Turkey is Turkic, is another issue between them. And of course the breakup of the USSR exposed again the bitter relationship with Armenia, and you have a situation in which Turkey backs Azerbaijan and Russia Armenia. So negative, but it's not as simple as that, because on the other hand, 40% of Turkey's energy comes from Russia. And that kind of dependency isn't just a powerful bilateral factor, it's also a component in the politics of energy sustainability, which is tremendously important for the interests of Turkey, Russia, and the West, and their interests don't coincide. There's trade and tourism, which matter to them both, and both have been used as a political tool in the relationship. At the outset of the Syrian crisis, Turkish support, Turkish opposition to Assad and Russian support for the Syrian regime led to a direct confrontation between the two, with the Turks shooting down a Russian fighter, allegedly in Turkish airspace. Russia, Iran, and Turkey were bitter rivals in the Syrian civil war, supporting different sides in the conflict. Russia and Iran backed the regime, providing military, financial, and political support, while Turkey assisted the Syrian opposition and provided a safe haven for its political and military leadership. But now, of course, Assad has effectively won. So this required from the Turks a rapprochement with Assad's key backer, namely Russia. And you've all seen that Turkey's relationship with Russia is kind of warming, and that factor plays an important role in that process. Russian support enabled the Turks to launch its first large-scale military operation inside Turkey in 2016, when Turkish troops and Turkish-backed opposition factions recovered more than 2,000 square kilometers from ISIS and Syria Democratic Forces on the western bank of the Euphrates. Last September, President Putin and President Erdogan agreed that Moscow and Ankara would jointly oversee a demilitarized zone between rebel and regime lines, intended to keep the pro and anti-Assad factions apart. And that did indeed keep the province of Idlib reasonably peaceful until about mid-April. But that has now collapsed. Russia and Syria want a foothold in Idlib, and a further 200,000 people have been displaced. Turkey wants to prevent a further Russian attack that could drive most of the 3 million refugees still living in Idlib towards Turkey. It also wants to take control of the Kurdish-controlled town of Tel Rifat and to deepen its current zone of control. I could go on, but I mean, the important fact is that the problem of the Kurds in Syria means that Turkey will remain entangled there. But this particular confrontation demonstrates the volatility of the Turkey-Russian relationship. Neither Turkey nor Russia have sufficient traction to impose a settlement in Syria, and any alliance between them to try to achieve that is unstable. Why is it unstable? It's unstable because there are other issues apart from Syria on which they're very often in conflict. I mentioned Turkey's support for President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. One consequence of this has been a developing relation with Qatar, which, as you know, has been isolated by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, and UAE because of its support for the Brotherhood. Turkey has a base there in Qatar, and it has reinforced that base. Last year, Qatar pledged a $15 billion package of economic projects, investments, and deposits for Turkey. Turkish antipathy towards Saudi Arabia and support for Qatar is shared with Iran. Turkey is very dependent on Iran for gas supplies and is a major Shiite rival to Sunni Turkey. But both oppose Saudi influence in Syria. Both have problems with the Kurdish minority. Common support for Qatar is a new variable. So, and you just see what I mean by one's enemy's enemy. Just forget all that. Part of that, of course, lies in the Sykes-Picot dispensation after the First World War, by the victorious Allies after the First War. And the victorious Allies didn't understand the inapplicability of the alienation of the nation-state to the region. It's a region where society was underpinned by identity, which was traditionally derived from ethnicity, tribe, or sect. And more recently, I have to say, the breakdown in the relationship between Turkey and the West owes much to neglect and rebuff by an inward-looking European Union, preoccupied with economic sanctions, and increasingly antagonistic towards Muslims since 9/11. 15 years ago, people like me used to say that the accession of a Muslim country like Turkey would greatly strengthen the European Union. But now Turkey's membership is effectively blocked by France and Germany. There have been repeated attempts by the European Parliament to formally end the accession negotiations. The Europeans have prevaricated over their pledge to enable visa-free travel in the Schengen area as part of the deal to restrict the flow of refugees from Turkey into Western Europe. In 2016, you will have read, there was a spectacular manifestation of the Turkey-Europe breakdown in a row over Turkish government electioneering in Europe, in particular in Germany and Holland, where there are substantial Turkish minorities. It was serious because it reflected the Turkish readiness to play the religious hatred card and the Europeans' readiness to respond in kind at a time of xenophobia and, as I say, increasing anti-Muslim feeling in the West. More recently, the killings of Muslims in New Zealand were exploited by the AKP in the local election campaigns in March. I think that probably brings me to the BRICS. The UK is traditionally a leading supporter of EU membership of Turkey, and it's still a European outlier. Erdogan's visit to the UK last year reflected an intention to forge a closer bilateral relationship than Turkey has with other EU members. The official justification for this was that the two countries will have similar relations and interests with the EU after Brexit. There may be something in this, though not, I don't think, nearly as much as the British government makes out. I mean, are we to suppose that if the UK doesn't leave the EU, then the bilateral relationship with Turkey will suddenly deteriorate? Or perhaps that it will join Germany, France, and the EU in criticising the rerun of the Istanbul municipal elections instead of remaining silent. You may have noticed that. I'll try to sum up this gloomy picture. First of all, I'm getting a bit philosophical at this point, so bear with me. I believe that no country, other than the United States and China, can safely operate without a framework of stable relationships which enable it to maximize opportunity and reduce risk. And that's something which, as you know, has sort of eluded 52% of the British population recently. Turkey used to possess this through its strong support for NATO, the transformative impact of the EU accession process, and the zero problems with neighbours policy, abortive though it may have turned out to be, which was introduced at the start of the AKP era. So this has been replaced by an opportunist and transactional approach to foreign policy, which exposes Turkey to events and forces outside its control, in particular in the Middle East. And it makes Turkey vulnerable to the policies of important actors whose interests may or may not coincide with Turkey's. One of these is the United States, a failing superpower whose policies are unpredictable. A second is Russia. In my line of business in the old days, we used to call the Soviet Union the upper Volta with nukes. Russia is more sort of Saudi Arabia with nukes. And you have to admire Putin's ability to exploit maximum impact from pretty limited military and other resources. And finally, there's the EU. This hasn't treated Turkey well, but Turkey has a customs agreement with the EU. The EU is the main destination of its exports. Its infrastructural and institutional links are with Europe. There's no upside for Turkey in distancing itself from the EU. I can mention one other issue because it's very topical at the moment, which is Turkey's intention to begin offshore drilling operations in an area claimed by Cyprus as its exclusive economic zone. This has been criticised by the UK and by the European Union, and it's potentially inflammable. Sorry, it wasn't a pun intended. It's of course a dispute which is a consequence of the division of Cyprus. Turkey and the internationally recognised Greek Cypriot government have overlapping claims of jurisdiction for offshore oil and gas. Turkey and the Turkish Cypriots believe that the island's resources should benefit all Cypriots, including the Turkish Cypriots. In fact, it's not hard to see how the Eastern Mediterranean reserves could be used as a contributing component to a settlement. Turkey is, after all, the obvious place to bring them ashore. Now the risk seems to be exactly the opposite happening. Overall, I wish this depressing picture was remediable. Turkey should come to see that the threat of regional turmoil can best be handled within the framework of policy rooted in stable relationships over the long term. On the other side, there's no sign of the kind of leadership in Europe or the United States which might help to secure this. That would require vision, recognition of a common strategic interest, and political bravery in the face of rising anti-Islamism in the West. And I frankly don't see much of those qualities around in the West. We live in a time when liberal democracy seems to be faltering. China forges ahead, it's supposed, partly because it's without a government which changes every few years, and so it can achieve policy consistency over a long period. Besides, democracy gets in the way of quick and forceful implementation of policy. Without it, you can simply ignore opposition and do whatever you want. Now, all of us here, I'm sure, believe that this will be a siren's call because of the damage which autocracy does to values which we hold dear. But it's also self-defeating in foreign policy terms. Nationalist pursuit of self-interest inevitably brings with it the opposition and enmity of those other countries whose interests are ignored. Populist leaders on both sides of the Atlantic regard the institutions of government such as parliament, the judiciary and free press as tiresome obstacles to the way they do things. We live in fear that President Trump and some foreign counterpart will feel bad when they get out of bed on the wrong side one morning and have a telephone conversation. It's not that President Trump or President Erdogan, or even for that matter Nigel Farage, who is set to do so well in the European elections, operate in a political vacuum. The traditional countries, governing classes in all our countries, I'm afraid, have belittled the causes which populist leaders claim to represent. And it's not taking those causes seriously which has only made those causes even more popular. Anti-Americanism isn't an invention of, in Turkey, isn't an invention of President Erdogan, it's deeply rooted. The same goes for Nigel Farage's view that the UK is a colony of the EU. You can see how the checks and balances of democracy sometimes seem obstacles to governments rather than strengths. But the right conclusion from draw from this is that our government should not be disconnected from the democratic will, as arguably was the case in both Turkey and the United States before Presidents Trump and Erdogan came to power. And it may be becoming so today in the United Kingdom. So that brings with it the loss of democracy and the fundamental values on which fundamental values and freedoms on which it's based. This may work for China, but for our purposes this evening, autocracy also delivers foreign policy, as I hope I've made clear, which is inconsistent and short-term, and thereby it threatens the very security and prosperity which supporters of strong government claim to champion. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We have lots of time for questions, and Martin will be circulating with a roving mic. So if you'd like to ask a question, could I ask you to put your hand up and identify yourself and keep your questions relatively brief, if you would. Thank you. So would anyone like to ask a question? Yes.
I'm interested. I was in Turkey at the time of the local elections, and it was sort of fascinating. People were watchful and waiting. I was doing a lot of universities. Now, it is really absorbing and remarkable that he's turned over the result in Istanbul. And what do we think is going to be the consequence of that? Which way will it go? And will it sort of light a tinderbox? Because I was interested in whether people weren't more sort of angry or fretful or didn't feel as though they were on the edge of blowing up at all. But this is quite a strong message to turn over the result of an election.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My wife and I were in Istanbul a bit before the election, and to demonstrate that Turks certainly haven't lost their sense of humour in spite of everything, we walked past a butcher's shop, and in the window we had a sign which said, "Brain free till after the election." Yeah, I mean, it is an extraordinary step to have taken. It reflects the importance of Istanbul to Erdogan. It's his hometown, it's of enormous importance to him. But it is fraught with risk, clearly. I mean, he did badly because his campaign appealed to support from those who regarded him as a great leader. It didn't address the economic problems which were increasingly mattering to Turks. Now both sides will claim victimization. I mean, his side will claim victimization on the grounds that they were cheated. And of course, the people who won will claim victimization because what was the matter with the election campaign? I think the one or two things worth saying about the outcome. The first, I think, is that a quite important thing is that the Kurdish vote in Istanbul went to the opposition. The AKP now need that vote. The question is how far they can go to gain it without infuriating the nationalists on their side. So that's a really critical point, I think, secondly, the economy will have to be regarded by everyone as an important issue this time. But your point about the state is tremendously important. I mean, he has already committed himself to, I think, 20 addresses, 20 speeches in Istanbul. So this is the president against Istanbul, and the stakes could not be higher. And I suppose you could say that the result will give us a glimpse of how Turkish politics will be handled in the future. It's very much more than a local election.
So, who would like to ask the next question? Yes.
Mina.
I'm a journalist. Since Turkish foreign policy is very much shaped and influenced by domestic concerns, I hope you will take my question in relation to foreign policy, even though I really want to ask, how do you see the last 20 years, or perhaps, let's say, last 17, 16 years, of Turkish society's transformation since the days that you were the ambassador in Mayfair? I think that probably helps us to understand
yes.
the situation.
Yes. I'm sure most of you here know that the polarization of Turkish society dates from the gap which grew between those whom Ataturk carried with him in Europeanizing Turkey and those who were left behind. And for a great many years, the secularist governments, who represented a minority, were able to run their country in a way which was, I think it would be fair to say, oppressive for the majority, and certainly, as I said earlier, certainly their failure was they failed to take seriously the interests of the majority. Now, the point I think, which of course becomes important, is the way that that majority, which was originally ignorant, poor, whatever, started to succeed. They became educated and more articulate and so on, and eventually they had a party which represented them in the AKP, which was so much more efficient than any of the other secularist parties, and in which these people could trust. I think it's entirely wrong to think of those people as the sort of thoughtless, poor, stupid masses. I mean, it was never true, but of course, as the years which Theodos has mentioned gathered away, it became increasingly less true. I mean, there are loads of millionaires in Turkey, successful people in every walk of life nowadays who support the AKP, and they are cosmopolitan and successful, but they resent the way they were treated previously, and they will do whatever they can to make sure that what happened then never occurs again. So, and the man who's provided that for them is President Erdogan. So, I think what I'm trying to say is that, well, first of all, I think it's probably a temptation in the United Kingdom to make a black and white contrast between the people on the one side and the wonderful secularists and the fearful Islamists on the other. It's not like that at all. And, secularists behave very badly in their own ways. But also, as I say, the people who support the AKP are a cross-section of Turkish society which matches the secularist part in many ways. It just happens to be devout and conservative. Now, there comes a point, of course, of saying, are people like that going to go on supporting President Erdogan forever? He may have achieved this for them, but does he still represent them? And maybe that may be the question you're asking, Chair. Thanks very much.
Christopher Carrington, member of the public. Would you accept the proposition that President Erdogan is not a particularly pious Muslim? He doesn't have a deep and sincere faith in Islam. He is more interested in employing and disposing or deploying Islam, both to build his power base within the country and to develop various aspects of his foreign policy, which are designed not to overrun and conquer other countries, not to make territorial gains, but to secure, above all, the territorial integrity of Turkey and its powerful defence.
Thank you. I'm not too sure that the second part of what you were saying, which I broadly agree, implies the first part. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know much about President Erdogan's religious practices, but it seems to me it's perfectly possible that he could be an entirely devout Muslim and still want to employ religiosity as one of his tools of governance. So, you know, I mean, I don't. As I said earlier, you know, you need to look at him as a product of a background and representative of that background in many ways. You know, he's not a sort of outlier. He happens to be the best politician the Turks have had since Ataturk. And he runs policy in the way he sees it extremely effectively. I don't think that says anything about, you know, I don't know how pious he is or not.
My point perhaps being that if he were a, for want of a better term, a true believer, shorthand, he would take a different view than if he were cynically manipulating forces supporting Islam to his political ends.
Well, I don't know. There are some politicians in the audience who might ask that question better than me. I don't think you can make that. I wouldn't draw that inference.
In one case, in the first case, you have an abiding piety, for example, which would be demonstrated in a very, very personal commitment to a particular set of beliefs. In the other case, you have, well, jolly useful, these beliefs. They help me to do all kinds of things that I want to do more easily and more effectively.
He appeals to a devout and conservative constituency. Of course, that's absolutely correct, but you're saying he manipulates the devout and conservative constituency. Manipulate, I don't know. I mean, he, you know, we may not, you know, the whole thing, we always have a lot of stuff for things which he does of which we don't approve, Well, I suppose we've had political leaders who said they were Christians who did things which we don't approve. I mean, yeah, what about President Trump? Bill.
This gentleman?
Can I turn the spotlight back to foreign policy,
yes,
and especially Syria?
Yes.
In a nutshell, what can Turkey do about Syria? Suppose Assad decides to try and retake Idlib every time that he wants to. What can Turkey do? What is Turkey likely to do, in your opinion? YPG. Is there any possibility of arranging some sort of deal between the YPG or PYD and KDP in Iraq?
Yes.
Because the fascinating thing is that Turkey has quite a good relationship with the Iraqi Kurds, in spite of the fiasco of the attempted independence movement. Can you comment on any of this?
Well, I think, as I said, the Turkish problem is that there is no country which has the power or influence to impose a solution on Syria. And the countries that are engaged there have differing agendas. So I think you're stuck in a very volatile situation. I suppose that the Turks are always going to be, well, as far from the sort of foreseeable future, stuck in Syria because the kind of Turks who are there are not like the ones in Iraq, and they regard the requirement for some kind of, well, not some kind of control over the border essential, and they believe that can only be obtained with a zone of some sort, I think. So that, they're sort of stuck with that, I think. And of course, as we all know, historically, it's a very, very difficult position to be in. And the Romans used to find themselves in this situation. And everyone from then onwards, what do you do? And the further you go, the more untenable the situation becomes. You go back and simply go behind the road. It's very difficult. I don't. And I'd be interested in what you think. What would you think, Bill?
Well, my
this is a great authority.
It all depends on the Russians. Russia is the dominant power. If Turkey is going to avoid getting sucked into a conflict within Syria, it's got to work through Moscow. And if it can arrange some sort of deal with the Russians, by which, for instance, the regime was able to resume nominal control over Idlib, but avoid creating another huge refugee wave, then that would be for the benefit of Turkey, but it would also be for the benefit of Russia, because Russia doesn't want a situation of open conflict with Turkey any more than Turkey wants an open conflict with Russia. That's the one thing. The YPG, PYD thing is much more complicated simply because we don't know which side of the bed President Trump is going to get out of. If he gets out of the one side of the bed and decides to pull out of northeastern Syria in order to concentrate his activities against Iran, and I think he's much more concerned with the Gulf than he is about Syria, actually, then a very interesting situation would arise, because the Syrian regime will automatically try to resume control over that part. And there is talk now going on about reviving the 1998 Ottoman Security Agreement, in which worked for a long time. And if they can go back to that, so much the better. But of course, it's not going to be at all satisfactory for the Kurds in Syria. I've got to admit that.
And I thank you very much. But I mean, I'm sort of right, because I say that there are other issues which inform the policies of Russia and Iran and as well, which make it more difficult.
Thank you. I think there was a gentleman here who had his hand up. Thank you.
You mentioned Cyprus and the drilling that's going on offshore. And having watched the Cypriot talks on and off over since 1974, I must say today I can't see any one or any reason why Turkey has an interest in trying to do a settlement in Cyprus. Tell me why I'm wrong.
It requires them to keep, 30,000 troops on the island, for starters, and a relationship with particularly Europeans, which is extremely difficult. if you're suggesting that the Cyprus solution is simply a division between the two parts of Cyprus, I mean, that's how generations of Cypriots have lived. I'm not sure that's actually what they want, even now. The talks under Annan, I mean, would probably have succeeded if the European Union hadn't screwed it up. From time to time, some government or another, the British or the Turkish or says, isn't it, why don't we just give up and settle for division? But then, even that raises quite hard questions, isn't it? Does Turkish Cyprus become independent or part of Turkey, or, I'm not, discounting your cynicism, that's the right word. But I think it's like so many things that people retain a policy objective because it's the most comfortable thing, and maybe in some ways desirable, when the alternatives raise big difficulties too. I do think that I seriously think that the drilling, point is potentially helpful. There are large undersea resources now off Israel, as you know. Where are they going to be brought ashore? Well, Turkey. That's going to take it, the pipeline would probably have to go through Cypriot waters. There is, the interest of both the Turks and the government of Cyprus in drilling around the island as well. I mean, you can see a potential upside in this. But doesn't seem that way at the moment.
Okay. Thank you.
Robin.
Take two.
Robin Cameron. Could you expand on your thoughts on Turkish relations with China and the rise of China and the possible friction around the Uyghurs and the Belt and Road Initiative and economic rivalries in Africa, etc.? Could you, take a long view on this?
To start with, of course, there are already Chinese firms operating in Turkey, and I had a sort of personal experience of this quite a long time ago now, when I was working for a company, a British company in Turkey, and it required a quite sophisticated bit of kit, normally supplied by the Australians or the South Africans. So we sought tenders from these major companies in Australia and South Africa. And then we thought, I don't know why we thought, well, why not China too? What happened was that the Chinese arrived with engineers, surveyors, scientists of every sort, by the score. They studied the problem very carefully, and they came up with a tender for a machine which was more sophisticated than either the Australians or the South Africans could manage, and cheaper. So, I suspect that the story of China and Turkey is going to be like the story of China in most places. They're very conscious of the relationship. I think they're probably better than some of us at characterizing it as rivalry. I think they work quite closely with the Chinese in Somalia. And of course, President Erdogan on his day will say China's much more important to us than to the West. And he's also, they've also had quite serious talks about the Beltway, to how that will benefit rather than exploit. So, I don't know, in many ways their position is the same as the rest of it when you do China, but they're closer to China. And, some cliche about Turkey being, looking both, looking east as well as the west.
You rightly talks about lack of leadership in Europe and United States in engagement with Turkey. I was wondering what would you suggest European leaders and how would they engage with Turkey in a peaceable climate in Europe and even an authoritarian leader in Turkey. And it seems like there will be no change in Turkish politics next 4 years in normal conditions. So what would be the agenda that you would push if you were working for European leadership?
Well, absolutely. I mean, of course, it requires a readiness to respond on the Turkish side as well, and that's a difficult requirement. But as I said, the European Union, and this is not just a point about Turkey, the European Union is currently tremendously introverted. The days when it was attempting to enlarge seem, seriously historical. Now all it does is put up barriers against migrants. It's concerned about its internal unity and Brexit, not just Brexit, but you have an issue of finance in the Schengen area. Eastern European members who have become disturbingly nationalist. So, all that is too much for this, I think. It requires, apart from anything else I say, a European leadership who are prepared to ignore or overcome the anti-Muslim sentiment which prevails so widely. It requires them to embark on policies in relation to a country which, for many of their constituents, many of their peoples, it's not that important, Turkey. To, as I say, to show a lot of political courage, because they're going to be dealing with President Erdogan, which exposes the criticism, at a time when they have other things on which they can lose support. Do they need another one? So, I'm not optimistic about this, but I do, in an ideal world, you would see some of that on the Western side and a willingness on the Erdogan side to respond. But there's no sign of that on our side.
There was a hand up over the side, on the far side.
Thank you. Mina Toxos, BIAA member. I'm an economist, and I'm sorry I'm venturing into areas that I'm not an expert in, but I wanted to follow up from Emre's question, which is, if you put the Turkish point of view of what's foreign policy problems that they have, I'm quite prepared to be critical, say they made a mistake, they thought Assad would go, they didn't. There are certain places where they did make certain mistakes, but it's such an unstable region, this tremendous geopolitical fault line that Turkey lies in. And given the disastrous, interventions by the US and this country as well in Iraq, and then 10 years of sanctions already in Iraq before the invasion, and now sanctions on Iran, and these are Turkey's major trading partners and so on. And you can kind of understand why Turks, the sort of anti-foreign sentiment is so high in Turkey. And they feel kind of put upon. And I think actually you said that Erdogan wasn't very democratic, democracy isn't leading his, and I don't know if I misunderstood you, wasn't directing his foreign policy, but actually I think his foreign policy is very popular. And he wins elections with it. So it's a really difficult one. And I just wondered, what I'm suggesting is that I think there should be a more sympathetic approach to Turkish foreign policy, recognizing the constraints that Turkey has to work within and so on. And they're just not prepared to put up and shut up, basically. But, Uyghurs are being hassled in China. They say that.
Thanks, Mina. I'm sorry, I obviously wasn't clear. I certainly didn't say he didn't need foreign policy. I said that I said that he's not, sort of free agent because his policies are rooted in Turkish opinion, of which anti-Americans are very, very strong. I think, yes and no. Of course, it's Turks say we live in a horrible part of the world, but they were a fully paid up, what's the wrong word, member of NATO. I mean, they were a supporting member of NATO. They were running an accession program in the European Union, which, things have gone wrong, but I thought had a genuine chance of success. And I think that the vision of Turkey as a bastion against instability and chaos in the Middle East was an absolutely legitimate one. Now, what's gone wrong? I mean, a lot of it, I'm afraid, I think, does have to do with the policies of the present government. They didn't need to get sucked into this Shiite-Sunni divide, did they? Why do they have to play this game with Russia? I mean, I take Bill's point entirely about the importance of Russia and Syria, but what are they doing in Syria, really, apart from protecting their minimal interest, which is the Kurdish one? So I understand that, sympathise with the Turkish view that we are often unfair about the problems which they face in foreign policy in other ways. But I don't think they're entirely blame-free.
But just coming back, I've had discussions with that party people, and they're saying, well, we got involved in Syria because we wanted to be on the table. We have this huge border with Syria, and they were going to carve up the country without us having a say in it. They were, it was a Kurdish question, of course, potential for some kind of Kurdish entity arising or whatever. But they just basically, the Turks feel that they've got to be listened to and made part of the decisions in the region. And I think that's what Al-Qaeda keeps trying to do. Now, not very successfully, clearly, but that's where it's coming from, I think.
Well, as I said, I applauded the Davutoglu revolution in foreign policy of reaching out and attempting to establish Turkey as, and we talk about strategic depth, of friendly relations with its neighbours. Yes, fine. But that's not how it's played out at all. And the secularist regimes, I disapprove of them in many ways, including in their foreign policy. But their foreign policy involved not having anything to do with anyone, really. Once you get involved, then you have to decide how you're going to get involved. I remember vividly, for most of my professional involvement with Turkey, particularly in the late 90s, there would be some Middle East crisis, yet another Middle East crisis, and the Prime Minister of the day, let's say Edgefield, would say, we're a Middle Eastern power, we must help sort this out. But they had no levers, no links, no connections, no Arabic speakers, absolutely nothing. Extraordinary. Once you start getting engaged, as the Davutoglu regime did, I think that's a good thing, but it does carry heavy responsibilities as well as, advantages.
Okay, there's a gentleman in the middle here.
Terry Milders. Perhaps I go back to the foreign policy of Syria again, the question. The discussion in Turkey suggesting basically the Turkish government is now reconsidering their policy very seriously on Syria, meaning that they have made a mistake, they narrowed down their foreign policy during the course of the war in Syria. My question is they have a certain red lines, such as relationship with the YPG, and arguably it is the sister organization of the Proscribed organization, PKK. But now we understand the United States is directly opening a channel between YPG, PYD and Turkey. Perhaps it's been suggested since the beginning of this year. And also we understand this relationship is going quite okay. I mean, how should we, in terms of their new foreign policy, how should we read this?
Okay, you know far more about this than I do, because you know perfectly well. I mean, there are a lot of Kurdish variables involved. I mean, you could start that kind of dialogue, and eventually the Turkish leadership are going to have to justify whatever it is that they're agreeing with the YPD to Turkey, to the Turkish people, which will be difficult, won't it? And that's it brings in the issue of the PKK, obviously, because once you start talking, because as far as the Turks are concerned, the YPD and the PKK are the same thing. How should we read it? Well, I mean, clearly positively. We have this extraordinarily difficult situation between Turkey, the United States, and the Kurds, an explosive one. If there's contact with some kind of general, that's very good. But I mean, it clearly depends on the red lines of the YPG as much as the red lines of the Turks, isn't it? And then, of course, what the United States are going to do about that, which one has simply no idea. The administration actually seemed quite sensible about it, but not their fault.
So we have time for one or two more questions. So this gentleman.
Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. Check from Turkish Embassy. Just as relating to the gentleman's statement about the reports that the United States opened the channel between Turkey and YPG, PYD, and it's quite okay. I don't know where you got that information. It's ridiculous, to be honest. And,
do you have a question, sir?
Yeah. Of course. I mean, I needed to raise this issue because there is this connection, undeniable connection between PKK, which is a terrorist and proscribed organization in the UK as well, and PYD, YPG, they are having instructions from the same headquarters, and they are having the same chain of command. So how do you see this frustration in Turkish public opinion? How do you see this from your angle, that Turkish public opinion is so frustrated about this connection not being made publicly in European circles? And what do you think Turkish public opinion think about this?
Well, you actually, I mean, I think you surprised me a bit, because I would have thought, well, first of all, it's quite a niche subject for the Brits, this. I mean, I don't think many of them think a lot about the relationship between the PKK and the PYD. Those of us who do, I think, recognise the point you're making entirely. So, I mean, I don't think you find that, I don't know, people in this room who know about the issue would say there is no connection between the PYD and the PKK. I don't think it's not. I mean, so if you're saying that the Turks are upset that Brits fail to make a connection between the PKK and the PYD,
I'm talking about the European, this media and European understanding and perception, and I'm not talking about the UK government position.
Well, no. I mean,
the perception in the European media and European public opinion, and its repercussion in Turkey. This is a terrorist organization who killed more than 40,000 people in Turkey over 30 years. So,
as I don't think you find Europeans denying, I mean, the PKK is recognised as a terrorist organisation by the EU, isn't it? I think, yeah. And to the extent that ordinary Europeans think about the PKK, I'm sure that they suppose it's a terrorist organisation as well. So I don't think that your concern is justified. I hope it's not. I would say, I mean, since you've given me the opportunity, that the Turkish media nowadays is extraordinarily and unjustifiably inflammatory in what it says about the behaviour of the West. I mean, a lot of what it says is simply untrue, and I think all of us who follow Turkey have noticed what's happened in the last few years to the Turkish press, and it's really shocking now. And if that press has had this effect on Turkish public opinion, public opinion's attitude to the West, I'm really sorry about that, and I think it's their fault, not ours.
Thank you. Was there one more question over the back there? Thank you.
Alan Parker. Returning to the election, or the rerun of the election in Istanbul, on what ground was the election that had been held set aside? And secondly, and I ask this of course respectfully, how clean, how free from government influence will any rerun be? It's obviously of extreme importance to President Erdogan.
The run is that some of the ballot boxes were...
Yes, there's allegations of criminality, I think, in the...
What sort of criminality?
I mean, it also, I think it's worth saying that there were ballots for neighbourhood administrators and municipal councils, as well as the mayor of Istanbul, on the same voting sheet. And it's only the one, and you put it in the same envelope, but it's only the one in connection with the mayor on which this point has been made, which is pretty funny too. So, I mean, your question, what will happen next, I'm on the fence idea. I mean, the CHP, who in the past, the main opposition party in Turkey, have, I mean, an unrivaled record of political incompetence. I mean, just unbelievable. But on this occasion, they were actually quite well organised, and they even had people sitting on bags of ballot papers to make sure they weren't fiddled with. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know, Your Worship, Judge. Judge. Nothing which would comply with the high standards of British law, anyway.
Is there one last question, or I will abuse my chair's privilege? So, yes. Yeah,
My name is Logan, and if you allow me, I would like to take it to Britain. So Britain is also the guarantor state of status.
Yes.
And I would like to ask you about Britain's Sharon's position, or from your time in Ankara. What is Britain's opinions about Cyprus? Like, what would like to get, or how they look to the issue between Turkish and Greek Cypriots? I would like to
well, very briefly, as Fred here said, I mean, it's a subject which has been going on for a long time. But I mean, in principle, we have over very many years worked hard for the reunification of the island, and there have been times when that has become quite close and then failed for one political reason or another. We had hopes for the talks, was it 18 months ago, and it's failed. And I don't think that anyone's been tremendously active on this point at the moment, but I mean, I'm quite sure the British government would say, in the right circumstances, they would push very hard still for the reunification of the island.
Would that be a case for Britain to back off from its guarantorship? Because, Greek Cypriots generally demand that Turkey, there should be no guarantorship. So,
well, I mean, I would suppose that in a Cyprus in which problems have been resolved and the country was united, there would be no guarantor powers, not just UK, but Greece or Turkey as well.
So I think that's a good point to say thank you for that amazingly wide-ranging talk. We've literally gone from World War II to Donald Trump, to energy security, human security, security, and also to the state of Turkish politics and British politics as well. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming. If we could say that.